Good morning, good afternoon. For those who are joining us in Washington, joining on the other side of the Atlantic, and those that are joining in Tbilisi, on behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, I want to welcome you. This is an event that's co-hosted with our colleagues at GMF's Bucharest office, the Black Sea Trust, and my colleague, Alina Inayeh, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. We want to welcome you. Our conversation today is going to be focused on a report launch on Georgia. And I think an incredibly timely report given what's taking place on the ground in Georgia and also what's taking place both in the US and in Europe as well. My name is Jonathan Katz. I'm a senior fellow and also a director of democracy initiatives at the German Marshall Fund. And I'm going to be moderating today's discussion with Ambassador Ian Kelly and David Kramer. And as I mentioned, unfortunately, Alina Inayeh is unable to join us for today's conversation. And we're going to discuss, what I mentioned as an incredibly timely report. And I know that the authors of this didn't plan it in this way, but it so happened that it did coincide with the challenges that we're seeing today. And this is the report is titled "The Country on the Verge: The Case for Supporting Georgia." And as I mentioned, Ambassador Ian Kelly and David Kramer are the lead authors, with several others weighing in this process. David and Ian, I just want to congratulate you on this report. Incredibly detailed, informative. There's a link in the invitation that everybody received and signed up for. So please make sure you take, if you haven't read it yet or read through it completely, please do so. But it's a telling report and a must read really for those who are in Washington or in Europe or in Tbilisi, who are looking at Georgia today and looking at Georgia's Euro-Atlantic integration, looking at Georgia's democracy, but also about support and how the U.S. And other partners should be engaging Georgia, and looking at it through multiple lenses: economic, security, political. And I think we're at a moment, I think in Georgia, it seems like there's always these junctures. This is one of those junctures, these key moments. And so we're really pleased to have David and Ian here to do this. And as I said, this couldn't be a more important time, post-election in Georgia. There's been what many view, including from Washington, as a real political crisis, one that needs attention. We know the EU is deeply involved in this, US Ambassador Degnan as well, including Christian Danielson, who is coming back to Georgia again to help mediate challenges between political parties. And this is a pivotal moment because Georgia's future hangs in the balance. And in this case, this report, which talks about a country on the verge, and the case for supporting Georgia, highlights a point that these two authors who have been long engaged in Georgia for decades from various positions are really looking at ways to support that engagement, strengthen relations between the United States and Georgia, as many have done, and to find a path forward. And both of them know quite well to the threats, the security threats from the north, from Russia, but also the challenges in the South Caucasus as well. So a lot to get to in this. And I just wanted to, thank them again. And I wanted to just quickly, if I can, do just a quick bio, and then we'll start off with David with a quick question. And I apologize for the length of my intro because we really want to get to them. We want to get to the authors of this report. So first, David Kramer. David is a senior fellow at Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. He's worked in senior leadership positions at the McCain Institute. He was a senior, as the senior director for human rights and democracy, leadership roles, leading Freedom House, and also at GMF. And so we're proud to also call David one of the family at GMF. He also served in 8 years in the U.S. Department of State, including as Assistant Secretary of Department of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, DRL. He was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs, and has held other senior positions as well. David, thank you for joining us today. Great to see you. And Ambassador Ian Kelly. He is Ambassador in Residence, International Studies and Slavic Languages and Literature at Northwestern University. He is also a retired senior foreign service officer who last served as the U.S. Ambassador to Georgia from 2015 to 2018. Previously served as the U.S. ambassador to the OSCE from 2010 to 2013, and has held a variety of high-level positions at the U.S. State Department and served as Secretary Clinton's spokesperson from 2009 to 2010. I won't go through the full Ian's full bio beyond that, but is somebody who's steeped in working in this region, including in Russia as well. So understands the issues from inside and outside. Ambassador Kelly, it's great to see you, Ian. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to just kick it off. And one of the things that I pose, this is for both of you to answer if you want to, but really maybe just give us a little bit a better understanding of the report and sort of the key takeaways for those that are interested. And I said this is a must read for those that are focused on Georgia and Washington, Europe, and in Tbilisi. And so, David, if I could just turn it over to you and to kick us off for this conversation.
Jonathan, thanks very much, Jonathan, for the introduction, and huge thanks to you, Alina, John and Alexander, who's helped us with this as well, and Nick Boucher for his great editing job. And I also want to offer a huge shout out to Nino Evgenidze and the Economic Policy Research Center, who has been a great support in this, and will translate the report into Georgian for any of our viewers who are tuning in from Georgia. So a huge thanks. And I reached out to Ian last summer thinking about Georgia, particularly with a transition here in the United States, and thought it would be a useful time to look at the US-Georgian relationship and what the United States might do, whether President Trump had been reelected or now with a new Biden administration. And the timing, I think, has worked out very well. I also would add our timing today is quite fortuitous in the sense that there is a hearing this afternoon in a subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on Georgia with two State Department officials testifying. So it's great to see that there is attention being focused on Georgia, though some of it is out of concern with the recent developments. Let me just highlight a few things from the report if I can, and start with why this matters, why a report on Georgia of all places. And it has long been seen as this island of democracy in a sea of authoritarianism. And Georgia now, as you mentioned with the title of the report, stands on the verge of going either way, either remaining that island of democracy or tipping into the sea. And we certainly obviously hope that it will remain this island of democracy in what has become an increasingly unstable region, particularly after the renewed fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan last fall. The United States, I think, without question, and with all due respect to our European friends and allies, has more influence in and on Georgia than any other country. And we argue in this report that the U.S. needs to step up its involvement and role in Georgia, supporting Georgia, including in trying to help facilitate resolution to the current crisis. And I think it is a crisis, and I think Ian will get into that in a few minutes. The U.S. has provided some $4 billion in military and non-military aid to Georgia over the past several decades to support Georgia's democratic transition and Euro-Atlantic aspirations, and also to help it defend itself against further Russian aggression. Let's never forget that since 2008, Russian forces have been occupying 20% of Georgia's territory. So what happened in Georgia then, now 13 years ago almost, was a precursor to what we saw unfold in Ukraine in 2014. In 2008, we didn't do very much about that invasion, and I think many have paid a price ever since. Georgia serves as a Western gateway for trade from Central Asia, and is the only economically viable east-west route that does not transit Russia or Iran. For pipelines, railways, highways for goods and resources, and route to the Black Sea and beyond. So economically, commercially, Georgia is a key player, including in the Black Sea region, where it has potential to really pick up its role and contributions to security and development. Georgian troops have partnered with the U.S. military and NATO forces in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere demonstrating Georgia's true commitment to being a net contributor to international security, and this before even being welcomed into the NATO alliance, which it very much wants to become a member of since really the late 2000s. And Georgia's answered nearly every call from both NATO and the EU, despite not being a member of either one, to serve in peacekeeping or combat missions. And there have been too many Georgians who have paid the ultimate price for its country's contributions in supporting stability and security around the world. The current crisis, and Ian will get into this more, comes at a rather unfortunate time for Georgia, where Georgia needs to be excelling and showing what a great model it can be in the region, but it also is critical for Georgia's own development, given the other challenges that Georgia faces. And let me just touch on those. The parliamentary elections last fall have led to a situation now where essentially Georgia is a one-party parliament. And that puts it in the rather undistinguished company of countries like China and North Korea, Cuba, and elsewhere. That's a situation that obviously needs to change. And there have been different assessments about the parliamentary elections last fall. The Georgian Dream, the party in power, cites the positives in the assessments that have come out. The opposition cites the criticisms that have been voiced by various domestic and international observers. Suffice it to say, the situation has reached a point where the opposition, to this day at least, has refused to take its seats in the parliament, and this boycott has led to this one-party situation that is not healthy for Georgia at all. The arrest of Nika Melia has made matters even more tense and turned a stalemate, I would argue, into a crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic has obviously devastated every country around the world, and Georgia has been no exception after handling it quite well in the first wave last spring. But the second wave, and perhaps an ongoing wave or a third wave, have really taken a toll. And I looked up the latest numbers this morning. Georgia has 278,000 cases. Reported 3,710 deaths so far, a pretty high number for a country of Georgia's size. So the toll has taken the pandemic rather has taken a significant toll in public health terms. It's also taken quite a toll economically as well, given the lockdowns that have been imposed and the restrictions on travel that we have seen too. That is a problem not unique to Georgia, but it underscores that Georgia, on top of dealing with the pandemic, cannot afford a political crisis as it's in right now. There's also the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, which I won't get into very much, but suffice it to say that that has contributed to instability in the region and has also resulted in the deployment of nearly 2,000 Russian troops in the Nagorno-Karabakh area, which means that Russian troops are now stationed in all three countries in the South Caucasus. Two by invitation, with Armenia hosting a Russian military base, now in Nagorno-Karabakh with Azerbaijan, and Georgia, of course, wholly uninvited. The Georgian government and the Georgian people asked Russian forces to depart, and they refused. So where does that leave us? The United States, as I said, does have outsized influence in Georgia, and I think needs to exercise that more vigorously. The Biden administration obviously has its hands full with many crises domestically and in foreign policy. We've seen heightened tensions between Washington and Moscow, Washington and Beijing. But with the new team coming on board, I hope sooner rather than later at the State Department, we will, I hope, see more engagement from the U.S. side. And I do want to give credit to the people who are already there, career people like George Kent, who does a great job with a number of challenging countries in his portfolio. We identified 7 specific recommendations, and I'll just highlight them in the interest of time here. First and foremost, to show more interest in Georgia's success, including by reinvigorating the U.S.-Georgian Strategic Partnership Commission. The United States needs to play a more prominent and visible role on the ground in Georgia, in addition to the embassy. We of course, had a gap between ambassadors after Ian left and a new ambassador was finally put in place because of some problems on the Georgian end, not the US end, to be clear. But we need to put more skin in the game, if you will. Second, we need to encourage Georgia to stay on the democratic, Western-oriented path. And the latest crisis underscores the need for this recommendation. Third, keep the door open for Georgia to join NATO and the EU. NATO member states, let's remember, in Bucharest in 2008 declared the following: NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership. We agree today that these countries will become members of NATO. Well, here we are in 2021, and there has not been anywhere near enough progress toward achieving this goal. Fourth recommendation, help Georgia build better checks and balances with strong democratic institutions, such as civil society organizations and independent media, which play an absolutely indispensable role in Georgia and elsewhere for that matter. Fifth, one that may seem a stretch for many people, but we think it's important to list, and that is to try to fast track a free trade agreement to the extent possible, recognizing there's quite a long line of countries looking for an FTA with the United States. Six, continue to help Georgia defend itself. And here I think the previous administration and I believe the current administration will continue to do a good job on this. And then that leads to the seventh related recommendation to help push back on Russian threats to Georgia. But if the current political crisis is not solved, and this may be a good segue, Jonathan, for you and Ian, a lot of these recommendations are going to become much more difficult to achieve. So let me stop there. Thanks.
David, thank you for that. And thank you for running through those recommendations. And I think you highlight a couple of things. One, there is heightened concern in Washington about what's taking place. And I think the Senate hearing today that you pointed out really speaks to that. But it also, I think, speaks to the interest in Washington and seeing Georgia succeed democratically and sort of follow through on all those lists that you'll find strong support for Euro-Atlantic integration, NATO, and also a recognition of what you mentioned too, is the sacrifice of Georgians who have stepped up on security issues to work with the United States, with NATO. And I think that can't be forgotten in this. But you also highlight there are some deep challenges on the ground, including COVID, which is not only wreaked havoc in Georgia, but also globally. And it's something that needs to be dealt with. Ian, if I could just bring you in now to you, were ambassador from 2015 to 2018. Maybe you can just pick up on from where David left off in terms of these recommendations. I think you know fully well what some of these security challenges that were raised, but also just on the issues of democracy, governance, judicial reform. David mentioned that there's a new administration highly focused on a democracy agenda, combating corruption. We've already seen signals of them going after certain actors, including in Ukraine, like Mr. Kolomoisky. I mean, just a new, I think really a renewed effort to support democratic transition. But I also wanted to ask you sort of both about the recommendations, what you see as being important, but also from your previous role, how does Georgia get back on track? And this isn't the first political crisis in Georgia. You both point this out in this report. There's been other challenges. What does the road ahead look like? And feel free to respond in any which way you want to David's opening. But I think these are some really relevant questions, because it is true the U.S. has a tremendous has influence, because it's worked so closely not only with Georgian government officials, but also with civil society, with Georgian business and others in support. And it's really worked across Georgia, not just singling any one group out, but really trying to lift Georgia up wholesale. So maybe I could turn to you to pick up where David left off.
Sure. Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks to the German Marshall Fund as well. And David, I thought you did a great summary of our recommendations. We did indeed see an opportunity coming this fall or last fall, with the two elections within about a week of each other. So we were looking at a juncture, really, a transition in many ways to new figures, new political figures on both in Washington and in Tbilisi. And I think our overriding goal here was to make sure that Georgia did not get lost in those transitions, particularly the transition in Washington. So, our main goal was to highlight just how important Georgia is to United States interests. Of course, we all know that Georgia is an important partner for the U.S. military. In my 3 years in Tbilisi, I really thought there were no closer, no sort of fraternal relationships between Americans and Georgians than there were between Georgian soldiers and U.S. Marines and U.S. soldiers. So that's very important how Georgia has been willing to put its sons and daughters on the line to serve side by side, not only with the U.S., but with all the countries in NATO and with the EU in peacekeeping operations in Africa. As David pointed out, it was really important for us to continue to support the territorial integrity of Georgia, and even more importantly, continue to support its aspirations to join the EU, to show that Russia and other non-NATO states have no say, no veto on the sovereign decisions of democratic states. I think it was also important, and this is again something that David touched on, it was also important to highlight that it's important for the United States that the whole idea of democratic governance, whole idea of liberal governance, of a liberal approach to trade and interstate relations, that it would succeed in what has become really an illiberal zone. And what I mean by that is the former Soviet Union minus the Baltic states. And then of course there's the whole idea of Georgia being a real critical part of this southern corridor that enables the economies of Central Asia to get their goods and their resources to market without having Russia having a hand on the spigot, and I think that would have a real kind of a virtuous effect if Georgia really succeed. Then there's a counter model to the Russian model of top-down governance, of what the Russians call a vertical power. And finally, I'll just wrap up by saying that it's no exaggeration to call what Georgia is going through right now a crisis. Georgia has seen before the gradual accumulation of power in one person and in one party. We saw it with Kamsahurdia, Shevardnadze, Saakashvili. And the more I did research on the history of Georgian democracy, the more I saw that tendency. But I think this is different, and it has a much more possible pernicious outcome if the political parties in Georgia are unable to resolve this situation and enable the opposition to take seats in parliament. We are looking at a very non-Western style of government. We're looking at a regime, and as things stand now, and this has been the problem, really, I think, throughout Georgian democracy, the problem of lack of checks and balances on the executive. And the most important aspect of having that kind of check and balance is a pluralistic parliament. You can't just have one party. So, I mean, these are sort of the essential essential problems that are creating this crisis. And it is really something. And I mean, in the near term, we need to get the opposition seated and have a democratic, have opposition voices in parliament. But in the longer term, Georgians really have to address in a very serious way the problem of judicial independence. There is far too much political use of the judiciary for commercial decisions, but unfortunately also for political and law enforcement decisions. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing questions.
Great. I wanted to, just on that, Ian, is just to remind everybody that there's a Q&A function on Zoom, and please feel free to post some questions. I see some coming in, but one thing I wanted to start with, to ask you is about how this current situation, if resolved, impacts Georgia's Euro-Atlantic integration process. I know Georgia Dream has a goal of at least, I think, starting EU membership talks by 2024. There's, they want to move the NATO process forward. I think everybody would like to see that be just to see some progress in that area. But I thought maybe asking both of you about the impact. You started to speak a little bit about, the prospect if things can't get unstuck. But, not only, I mean, there's a domestic political ramifications, but there's also external as well, and what signals it sends to partners like the United States and the EU. So maybe if you could answer that question, if both of you, I don't know who wants to answer that first. David, do you want to jump in? And then
Sure.
Okay.
Thanks, Jonathan. Prime Minister Garibashvili was just in Brussels last week, met with EU leaders, met with NATO leaders, seemed to have good meetings, but let's be honest, this crisis is terrible for Georgia's prospects for Euro-Atlantic integration. Georgia has stood out in part, it's a beautiful country, wonderful people, great food and wine, but also because it has, for the most part, been a pretty strong democracy. And Georgia risks veering from that democratic path if this crisis doesn't get resolved soon. Ian is absolutely right to talk about the medium and longer term objectives. There is an immediate issue that needs to be resolved. And I think in order for the opposition and Georgian Dream to sit down and hammer out a compromise, the Georgian authorities need to release Nika Melia, the leader of the UNM party, the United National Movement. It's the leading opposition party. Neither Ian nor I carries any water for UNM or any other opposition party, nor do we carry water for Georgian Dream. But I think it's, excuse me, I think it's just logical that you can't have the leaders of the various parties sit down and negotiate as long as one of them is sitting in jail. So there needs to be an immediate resolution to that part of the crisis. And then it will be up to the Georgian parties to sort out the compromise. Ian is right that I think the Georgian opposition after that should return to the parliament, but then the Georgian Dream should find some way of granting some influence and positions of power in the parliament to the opposition so that it is not just a fig leaf kind of representation for the opposition. This is a crisis that, if not resolved, is going to set Georgia back. And the United States will look at Georgia and say, we have enough other problems to deal with countries that can get past these political crises. We'll focus on them and not on Georgia. And that would be terrible for everyone.
Ian, do you want to respond to?
Yeah, I mean, just I think one thing that I would really like to hear out of the Brussels, the EU headquarters and NATO headquarters, is just a simple exhortation or just a simple statement of fact that a one-party parliament is incompatible with joining either organization. I think we need to have a much more clear statement on that. And I think that you don't need to talk about sanctions now. If you talk about the present status quo as preventing Georgia from attaining its #1 foreign policy priority, that I think should be incentive enough for both sides to compromise. I think NATO actually has been a little more clear on that, but I would like to hear the EU simply say, this is unacceptable. This is the present situation will not lead you to your #1 foreign policy aspiration.
And I hear that this afternoon, by the way, from senators and from the State Department representatives at the hearing in the Foreign Relations Committee too. I hope there are clear signals sent on a bipartisan basis that the current situation is in fact unacceptable and doing harm to Georgia's aspirations. I agree with you.
Yeah, and I think in all of this, you still see strong support from the Georgian public to move in a certain direction. So it's really about, in some sense, really fulfilling what the Georgian public wants to do. And I know one of the questions we had, and I wanted to raise this too because I think they've been sort of in the crosshairs of is a question about what do you think about the role of civil society and election watchdogs in this current crisis. I mentioned earlier that, and I think important that, that all parts of Georgian society are needed for democracy to succeed. But maybe, Ian and David, you both have worked with Georgian civil society or engaged directly with them. And Ian, I think you've even in the past have stepped up when there's been some challenges as well, because this is Georgian politics can be rough and tumble. There's difference of opinion, but maybe you could just speak to the role of civil society. And we have no less than 17 questions in the queue, and we'll try to get to all of those. So maybe just speak to that, because I think it's important to talk about the role of civil society. I don't know who wants to take that on. Ian?
Yeah, the civil society is the absolute beating heart of Georgian democracy. It is, I think, it does provide, I think, the greatest or the most vibrant check and balance against the power of the executive, holding government to account. In my time, I was seeing an erosion of other traditional checks and balances, like the presidency, the independent media, especially independent television. And, I'm not in Tbilisi anymore, obviously, so I don't have the kind of on the ground feel that I had, obviously, but it seems to me that civil society is the most important check against the power of the executive. I think one of its vulnerable spots is the Georgian economy has not grown to the extent where civil society can exist on domestic sources alone. It relies quite a bit on EU and US funding, and that I think leaves it open to some criticism of partisanship. And I think that's one reason why David and I talked about the importance of encouraging a free trade agreement, more foreign investment, more trade. And that's all in the, under the rubric of building a real resilient state. You really need a growing economy to have a resilient state and have a real vibrant civil society sector.
I would just add two things. One is Ian and I felt a need to include an author's note in this report that acknowledges the problems here in the United States and increases, I think, the dose of humility that we need to bring, not just in assessing Georgia, but frankly, any country around the world, given some of the major problems we've gone through here in the United States of late. I think that's important to acknowledge. That said, Ian and I come at this as huge admirers and friends of Georgia. We have many, many, many friends in the country. Ian lived there. I've traveled there many times. Civil society is indispensable, as it is in most countries, but in Georgia in particular, I think it plays a critical role. And so do the media, whether they're independent or with one side or the other. And the reason I mentioned the author's note, the acknowledgments about problems in our own country, the situation is not helped when politicians of either the opposition or the party in power start attacking civil society and the media. Nor is it helped, Ian referenced about the use of the judicial system for political purposes, when Tbilisi court gives an order to go after a station like Perbeli over the controversy of this recording. And so there needs to be a better job of recognizing that the role of the media and civil society may not always work and serve one's political purpose, but they're serving the country's greater goals and objectives. And they need to be left alone. They can be criticized. I mean, no one's immune from criticism, but being attacked the way they have been in some cases is really unhelpful and damaging to the country.
We're up to 26 questions, but we're gonna try to work our way through.
Quite a few of them are from one person, I see, which is great. I'm glad he's engaged. A couple of themes that run through this, a couple of questions. One is this idea that the EU obviously is putting forward a strong effort to mediate and resolve the current impasse. As was mentioned, David, you mentioned that the U.S. has outsized influence in Georgia. There's obviously deep concern in Washington about what's happening. Several of those questions we're asking whether or not the United States, Ambassador Degnan is obviously deeply involved, but shouldn't this be raised to a higher level within the U.S. government, rather than the U.S. playing sort of what some people are describing as more of a backseat role to the leadership role in this? Wouldn't we want to see this? And I'll add my own to this. In this region, the South Caucasus, we saw in the NK conflict, the U.S. not in a real lead role, and maybe speak to what you think the role of the U.S. should be. Is it the moment right now to have a higher level, more visible effort with Georgia, understanding that there's a number of other crises and challenges globally, is there a lesson to be learned about what took place in the fall, which, as you rightfully said, has led to the point where you now have Russian troops in now both in Armenia and Azerbaijan, and the landscape has changed. So maybe it's time for the U.S. to be more involved in a more leadership role. So that's one question. The other one is about Russia. Several people asked about the role of Russia in the current political impasse and situation. Is Russia playing a role? And I think there's some things that are happening that Russia's doing as this is happening. But maybe you could also ask about the Russian role. But how does what's happening in Georgia impact Russia, its interests, its calculations? So a question about the U.S. role, and then also about Russia. So I don't know who wants to. Well, maybe I'll start with the U.S. role. You can jump in on Russia if you want. There's an unfortunate reality, which is I don't believe Wendy Sherman has yet been confirmed by the Senate, but there's only one person in the State Department that's been confirmed by the Senate, and that's the Secretary of State, which means that the State Department is really short on people who can approach these issues with real authority. Again, I mentioned George Kent before. He's right now the highest level person, and he's a great guy, but he has some other countries that are occupying his time too. And so this is where I think Georgia has the benefit of having a lot of interest on Capitol Hill. There are some countries that do. Georgia really stands out. There is a lot of bipartisan support for Georgia in both the House and the Senate. And this is where I think in the interim, perhaps, in the absence of more people on board at the State Department, members of Congress could play a role, either through statements, through the hearing this afternoon, and when time permits, travel to Tbilisi. I think it is critically important that the United States show interest as well as concern about what's happening there. And if the administration doesn't quite have its ducks lined up, Congress can step in. The pandemic obviously poses a huge challenge. I mean, I appreciate that both Michelle and Danielson have been able to travel, but traveling in the middle of a pandemic poses unique challenges. So we do need to increase our profile, however, because the Europeans are giving it their best shot, and I really salute them for what they're trying. Danielson is going back, as you said, Jonathan, but I really think the United States is going to have to pick up its game and play a more prominent role here.
Ian?
Yeah, on the issue of Russia, the events in the South Caucasus and Nagorno-Karabakh and around the region were disturbing, obviously, for the violence and the human cost of the start of a new war. But I think, for me, it was really also very disturbing to see how the United States and France, who were the other two co-chairs, who were leaders agreed would take the lead in negotiating, were elbowed out of the whole equation, were just marginalized. Also, one of the agreements was to have an international peacekeeping force to enforce the ceasefire, and this is a Russian-only boots on the ground. So now you have Russian troops in all three Caucasus countries. And this just sends a very clear signal to everybody in the South Caucasus that if you have concerns about your territorial integrity, you have concerns about the stability of your country, there's only one arbiter for that, and that's Russia. And that's a very damaging signal for the 2/3 and more Georgians who really have a European vocation. They want to turn west. They don't want to turn north. So that was very, very concerning. And also, I think, if you have alternative routes out of the Caspian Basin, which this agreement also provides for, with new corridors across, between Azerbaijan and Nakhichevan, it just gives Russia more control on these exit routes for resources, for goods, services, and the movement of people. So, in terms of what Russian interests are, well, is to keep the South Caucasus in its orbit using various means, kinetic and otherwise. But it's also to prevent the emergence of a real pluralistic democracy. And so obviously the people in the Kremlin right now are quite satisfied looking at the emergence of a one-party state in Georgia.
Ian, can I just, follow up, one of the questions posed is about assessing the degree of Russia infiltration. I assume this means in Georgia, political, economic, and security. I could stick in. What do you think assess of the degree of Russian infiltration of the United States as well? But for this conversation, let's focus on Georgia, because I think that one of the challenges, I know when you were ambassador, part of the effort was to and had been for several years, is to help Georgia economically wean itself off of any dependence, because Russia would cut off trade and use it as a tool, hybrid tool, along with energy. And I'm just, as somebody, you were there for 3 years, and I'm just, maybe your assessment or thinking about when you look at Georgia today, when you look at sort of economic, security, political, do you see a difference in terms of infiltration in Georgia that's different than when you saw maybe in 2015? Because I think there was a few of these questions, and I think this is attached to the one that I just asked about Russia's role. I think there is concern from some quarters about, about growing economic dependence, or how Russia infiltrates different parts of Georgia or sectors. But I thought maybe, and David, please feel free to jump in too, because I think it requires, also thinking on the Western or sort of US and European side, how best to support those Georgians that don't want to have that dependence move in the right direction.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've seen that's very concerning is the increasing use of far right groups, anti-Western groups, very traditional civil society organizations that support traditional values. In many ways, it is similar to what we saw in 2020 in terms of supporting some of Russia supporting some of the far right voices in the American conversation. But I think we've seen it increasingly in Georgia. And they're the kind of message they're trying to reinforce is kind of the siren song of neutrality. They're not trying to convince Georgia necessarily to join the Collective Security Treaty Organization or to have increased political ties, diplomatic ties, whatever. It's more that the message that if Georgians, if you want your country back, if you want to get full territorial integrity, you got to cut a deal with Russia. And so these are the kinds of groups, media outlets, and political parties that are being supported by Russia. And there have been some organizations that have uncovered some documentation of that kind of support, and that's outlined in our report.
So I would just add, Nino Evgenidze's EPRC and the McCain Institute issued a report, I think it was the last year or the year before, on Russian disinformation, which is a problem not unique to Georgia, obviously, but is a problem in Georgia. And so there needs to be attention focused on that. I think there's also been some concern about the Georgian government's lack of pushback on some of the Russian rhetoric and efforts that we've seen, including, and this is not, again, a problem unique that has happened under Georgian Dream leadership, but the creeping annexation by Russia into Georgian-controlled territory. Of course, there was the incident in June 2019 with the Russian parliamentarian Sergei Gavrilov, who showed up invited by Georgian Dream in the Georgian parliament, spoke from the speaker's chair in Russian. That caused an outburst of protest. And let's also just boil it down quite simply. Putin doesn't want to see Georgia succeed. And what does that mean? He doesn't want it to become a vibrant democracy, more deeply integrated into the Euro-Atlantic community. It's as simple as that. He wants to maintain Georgia under Russian control. And I think we need to do a better job of explaining those differences. I've seen some of the questions asked, what could we offer Georgia? And I've seen some points about FTAs, and fair enough, it may be a long stretch to reach an FTA. It's hard to say what approach on trade agreements the current administration will take. And it's possible negotiating one with Georgia could be easier than one might think, but it would mean jumping ahead in the queue. I'm not an expert on trade agreements, but let's also keep in mind, Georgians, as we've said, are the most pro-American country in the region. It's not as if we have to persuade Georgians about the values and interests in integrating more deeply into the Euro-Atlantic community. They're already there. What we need to do is to deliver. And Georgians need to deliver. It's a two-way street. The Georgians need to live up to their end of the bargain, but we also need to live up to our end of the bargain. And we say keep the door open on NATO. We're not taking this lightly. It is a huge step, but we also can't let Russian occupation of Georgian territory, 20% of Georgian territory, become a de facto veto over Georgia's aspirations. We need to get more serious about how we can move forward with Georgia's membership in NATO, because countries that become members of NATO become more secure countries. It's not to say there are never problems. There are some examples one could cite, but it would benefit both NATO and Georgia for sure. And Georgia's already demonstrated its readiness and ability to contribute to NATO operations even before becoming a member of NATO.
You know, David, I think these are all good points. There's a NATO meeting this week of foreign ministers. Secretary Blinken's there. It looks like there'll be a NATO summit, and likely in June. And what would be the advice to Georgian leaders? And I think, you know, I think there's heavier obstacles to overcome in Europe where there's skepticism. I think this type of crisis feeds into some skepticism. You know, what do Georgians need to do, particularly on the reform front? What are the leading issues that they need to really, obviously resolving the impasse we know is the number one obstacle, but beyond that, it seems that there's some structural challenges, judicial, electoral, and otherwise, that are also deeply connected to any type of FTA would need to have these types of issues resolved. But maybe just asking both of you what you view as the key to unlock, you know, the reforms that are must-have, and you know, in order to help move this process forward. And you know, is there anything new or that we could be doing, or others, partners of Georgia, should be doing on the democracy front? One of the questions posed was, you know, what else are you recommending? And the other part is this a situation where we're, you know, are there, you know, is it carrots and are there sticks too? Are there things that you know that might be? And I know others have brought up in some of the questions, you know, what's the best strategy moving forward, and what are the key reforms? So I don't know who, Ian, do you want to jump in, or David? Okay, Ian. Okay.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, in this early stage of this impasse or this crisis, and I do like to think it's still the early stage. I think we should talk more in terms of incentives. And you know, you pointed out, Jonathan, one of the incentives, and I think one of those incentives would be that June summit, and where we could talk about the possibility of us being unable really to be forward-leaning, maybe not forward-leaning, but how difficult it would be for us to progress in NATO's relationship with Georgia in a situation where you've had a inability of the opposition and the government to come to an agreement. So that's, I think, you know, one incentive that we could do. But also, you know, as David has said, it's also up to the Georgians to show to the members of NATO that they are going to be a net provider of security, rather than as one senator at the Secretary of State's confirmation hearing said, that there would be war the day after Georgia became part of NATO. So there are things that Georgia can do to reassure some of these reluctant allies, and that's to provide more access to NATO, particularly on the Black Sea. I think, you know, the Black Sea in many ways is the connecting tissue with not only NATO but with Europe, and they could offer to provide NATO with better facilities than they have now in terms of a port, a deep sea port. They could offer to host a NATO center of excellence, and then on the political side of it, I think they need to not just look to Berlin and Washington. They need to look to some other centers of support, and of course that would be the Eastern European NATO members, and the Baltics, of course, and not just the three former Soviet states, but also Norway and other countries that are much better inclined to seeing Georgia as extending the borders of security rather than inviting in insecurity by accepting Georgia into NATO.
David, do you want to jump into these questions?
Yeah, I would just say on the concerns on democracy, the election was not perfect, and there are improvements that need to be made. Look, there was a compromise reached a year ago between the opposition and Georgian Dream on the way forward with the elections. There was also supposed to have been release of all political prisoners, and Mr. Rura still sits in prison to this day. He needs to be released as part of that year-old agreement. But there needs to be some electoral reform so that there is greater trust in the elections, again, with the proper humility coming from an American that we offered in our author's note, given what we went through in our election here. There needs to be more judicial reform. Ian mentioned earlier about the use of the prosecutor's office and the courts to even political scores. That is not healthy for Georgia. There need to be more protection for journalists, protection for civil society so they can do their job, greater transparency. And let me also just mention, I think, sort of the elephant in the room, if you will. There needs to be accountability. And by that, I mean, if you want to exercise influence and power in Georgia, you should hold an elected position or be appointed to a position that requires approval by the parliament. Having somebody behind the scenes pulling the strings is not a healthy way for Georgia to move forward. And I know Mr. Ivanishvili announced he was retiring from politics, a month or two ago. It seems pretty clear he is still the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. And Georgia needs to move beyond this very personalized politics, whether it's Saakashvili or Ivanishvili. It needs to have a more broad-based form of support for political platforms. This use of power where once you get it, you want to make sure the opposition never returns to power. That is an unhealthy mentality. Again, not unique to Georgia, but if Georgia aspires to join Euro-Atlantic institutions, Georgia almost faces an added burden to prove itself. In many respects, it has, particularly with the military contributions. But when it comes to the democracy, there's more to be done, and we can help. But Georgians have to pursue this path as well.
Thank you for that. We're getting close to our allotted time, and I did want to just come back to both of you for final thoughts. And Ian, I want to come to you too, because I think just maybe picking up on what David said about this issue of leadership internally within Georgia, and the roles that you guys have pointed out, where you typically have one party dominance, and so this pendulum swinging and fears of retribution. Again, I think it's a particularly important moment. I think you have an administration in Washington that's very supportive of Georgia, wants to see Georgia succeed on its Euro-Atlantic track, but is also really, I think in a way that we haven't seen, is really demanding and both internally of itself, as you guys are humbly wrote about at the beginning of your report, where you were talking about the events of January 6th, but also really pushing partners to deal with these domestic issues and move forward and strengthen their democracies out of sheer concern about security, prosperity. And Georgia is in the crossroads between, in a particularly tough neighborhood, and it can't afford necessarily mistakes. But maybe you could pick up and maybe give some final thoughts. And David, then we'll turn to you for the last word. Over to you, Ian.
Yeah, in terms of final thought, yeah, Jonathan, you hit upon, I think, a real kind of endemic issue, we'll say, in Georgian politics. And that's the idea of personalization of power, where people tend to identify the government in terms of one charismatic leader. And I think that is, it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous because it really stunts the development of leaders, of new generations of leaders, when you have these leaders who stay in politics for several generations sometimes. And this is just, it seemed to be a real opportunity in 2000, I'm trying to get my date right here, 2017, when Prime Minister Kivlikashvili really wanted to move more power into parliament. And that was a real lost opportunity for the development of Georgian democracy and the development of democratic institutions. But I do think that Georgia has to recognize how dangerous this this reliance on personalized power has been, from Gamsahurdia through Shevardnadze and Saakashvili down to Ivanishvili. And I will say that I think it would be a lot easier to resolve this crisis if both of those figures, Ivanishvili and Saakashvili, who are not accountable to the voters, would withdraw. Ivanishvili has said he would withdraw, but I agree with David, he hasn't withdrawn.
David, over to you, and then we're going to close our session.
Sure. Well, Jonathan, first, let me just, again, thank you and GMF and Alina and everybody for hosting us, for being the sponsor of the report. And I want to thank the viewers, too, who have asked great questions. A particular thanks to Mr. Gunther Fellinger for all of his questions and comments. I do really appreciate them. Very thoughtful. The point of this report was to bring attention to Georgia. We do it as sort of neutral observers, but who care passionately about Georgia. We're neither on the opposition side nor the government side. We don't want to see the Georgian people suffer as a result of a political crisis that can and should be resolved so that Georgia can continue to move forward. That's in Georgia's interest. It's in the United States' interest. And so we hope, whatever it takes, that this will get resolved immediately. Another day is a missed day of opportunity for Georgia. This has to get resolved. It's not healthy for the country and the Georgian people, who are struggling with the pandemic as it is, are going to pay the price if this doesn't get resolved quickly. So thanks again for doing this. Really appreciate it. And we hope that we have generated some further ground for debate and discussion about Georgia. And I look forward to the hearing this afternoon in the Senate.
Thank you. And we urge everybody to, if you haven't had an opportunity to read through the report, please, definitely do that. Ian, David, thank you so much on behalf of the German Marshall Fund. We're pleased to host both of you. And I can see, even as we're closing, we have more questions in the queue than we have time to deal with. So we'll try to go back and answer as many as we can. And but I think it just highlights the interest both in Georgia on both sides of the Atlantic, the desire to find a way forward. I think with this new administration, there's new opportunities for that type of engagement. But a lot of this is up to the Georgians and Georgian leadership right now to find a way forward. But there are partners in Brussels, in Washington, across the transatlantic space that want to see progress in Georgia and the Georgian people meet their goals. With that said, thank you to everybody. We will post this as well, the video. So if anybody came halfway through but wants to see more, or wants to watch again because they want to hear David and Ian and
if
their
you're an
thoughts,
insomniac,
please do so. Otherwise, have a great rest of your morning, and if you're in Tbilisi, your evening. And we look forward to the next conversation on Georgia and this region. Thank you, and have a good rest of your day.
great. Thanks,
Thanks very
Jonathan.
much.
Thank you all
Appreciate
for joining us.
Bye.